"You people should stay invisible," Daniel Hayes said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the soft jazz and clinking glasses. And just like that, the entire room shifted, forks froze midair, conversations died in half-sentences, and every eye turned not to him, but to the woman standing beside his table. Ava Monroe didn't move. Not immediately. She stood there in her crisp black uniform, posture straight, hands steady, her expression unreadable under the warm amber lights that made the marble floors glow like polished gold. This wasn't just another night at Viridian House. This was where deals worth tens of millions of dollars were whispered over aged bourbon and silence was currency. Daniel Hayes sat at the center of it all like a man who believed he owned not just the room, but the air inside it. A self-made tech billionaire with a reputation for closing deals before dessert and breaking people before coffee. He didn't look at staff, didn't acknowledge presence. To him, service was invisible, expected, automatic. But Ava saw everything. The subtle glances between investors, the hesitation in signatures, the way one misplaced word could collapse an empire. She had been moving quietly between tables all night, refilling glasses, adjusting settings, listening without ever appearing to listen, because invisibility, when chosen, was power. Daniel flicked his wrist dismissively, sliding a folded contract closer to the edge of the table as if it were already beneath him. "Just bring the wine and stay out of the conversation," he added, a faint smirk curling at the edge of his lips. A few guests chuckled softly, the kind of laughter that comes from discomfort, not humor. Ava stepped forward then, slow, deliberate, placing the bottle down with a soft, controlled motion, the label facing outward, perfect, intentional. Her fingers brushed the edge of the document for just a second, and her eyes scanned a single line, just one, but it was enough. The kind of detail most people in that room would miss because they were too busy performing power instead of understanding it. She straightened, her voice calm, almost gentle. "You might want to review Clause 7 before you sign that." The words didn't rise, didn't challenge. They simply landed, precise and undeniable. Daniel paused, not because he respected her, but because no one spoke to him like that. Not here, not ever. His gaze lifted slowly, meeting hers for the first time, and in that brief moment, something unfamiliar flickered across his face. Not anger, not yet, something closer to curiosity. The room leaned in, silence stretching tight like a wire, and somewhere in the distance, a glass clinked too loudly, breaking the illusion that everything was still under control, because it wasn't, not anymore. Daniel Hayes did not like being interrupted, especially not by someone he had already dismissed. His fingers hovered over the contract as his eyes narrowed slightly, scanning the page as if he could force it to reveal something new through sheer authority. The investors around him shifted in their seats, subtle but noticeable, because doubt had entered the room and doubt did not belong in Daniel's world. "Clause 7, he repeated, his voice calm but edged, the kind of calm that usually came before a decision was made and someone else paid the price. Ava did not step back. She did not apologize. She simply tilted her head slightly toward the document. "The distribution clause," she said softly. "The part where you give up exclusive rights after 90 days if performance metrics are not met." A pause followed, not dramatic, not forced, just enough to let the weight of the words settle. One of the older investors leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, his eyes scanning quickly, and then it happened, the smallest shift, a breath held too long. A pen lowered instead of lifted. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, because he saw it now, the detail he had overlooked in his rush to dominate the room. The clause was real, and it was expensive, very expensive, the kind of oversight that could cost not just money but reputation, and reputation was the only currency Daniel valued more than profit. He leaned back slowly, buying himself a second, then another, his gaze never leaving Ava this time, studying her as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood. "And you caught that?" he asked, not with respect, but with something close to it. Ava gave a small nod, nothing more, as if it were obvious, as if it were expected, and that was what unsettled him most, not her knowledge, but her certainty, around them. The room began to shift again. Conversations restarted in low whispers. Not about the deal, but about her, about the waitress who had just corrected a Billionaire in a room full of people too cautious to do the same. Daniel closed the contract slowly, deliberately, his fingers pressing against the paper as if grounding himself. Interesting, he said, the word hanging in the air like a test. He was not used to being challenged, but he was even less used to being wrong. And in that moment, something changed, not loudly, not visibly, but fundamentally, because power had just been questioned, and the person who questioned it was someone he had not even considered worth noticing minutes ago. Ava reached for the wine bottle again, refilling his glass with the same steady precision, her movements unshaken, unaffected, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But everything had, and Daniel knew it, because for the first time that night, he was no longer controlling the room, he was reacting to it. The wine settled in the glass like nothing had changed, but everything had. Daniel Hayes did not reach for it this time. Instead, his fingers rested lightly on the table, tapping once, then stopping, a habit he had when recalculating. When something in the equation no longer added up, he glanced around the room, catching the subtle shift in energy. Investors who had leaned back before were now leaning forward, watching, waiting, not for him, but for her, and that realization landed heavier than the clause itself, because attention was power, and it was slipping. "What is your name?" he asked finally, his tone measured, controlled, but no longer dismissive. Ava paused for a fraction of a second, not out of hesitation, but choice, then answered, "Ava." Nothing more. No last name. No explanation. Just enough to exist in the moment without giving anything away. Daniel nodded slowly, repeating it once in his mind as if filing it somewhere new, somewhere important. "Ava," he said aloud, this time with intention, as though the name itself required acknowledgement. A few guests exchanged glances, sensing the shift but not yet understanding it, because they were used to seeing power asserted loudly, not quietly redirected. Daniel picked up the contract again, flipping back to the page, this time reading every line, every condition, not trusting his own memory, not trusting the room, and certainly not trusting the silence that had begun to work against him. Ava stepped back, slightly, not retreating, just repositioning, giving space while maintaining presence. A balance few people mastered and even fewer noticed, but Daniel noticed now. He noticed everything. The way she moved without urgency, the way she watched without staring, the way she spoke only when it mattered. It unsettled him, not because it was wrong, but because it was effective. One of the investors cleared his throat, breaking the tension just enough to remind everyone that the deal was still on the table, still real, still waiting. "Perhaps we should revisit the terms," he suggested. Carefully, and for the first time that night. Daniel did not respond immediately. He closed the contract again, slower this time, deliberate, then looked directly at Ava, holding the gaze longer than necessary, longer than comfortable, as if searching for something behind her calm exterior, something that would explain how a waitress had just altered the trajectory of a multi-million-dollar agreement with a single sentence. But Ava gave him nothing more than what he had already seen: composure, clarity, control, the kind that did not need to be announced, the kind that simply existed. And that was when it shifted again, deeper this time, not just the room, but him, because Daniel Hayes was beginning to understand that he had misjudged the most important person at the table, and he did not yet know how costly that mistake was going to be. The air in the room no longer belonged to Daniel Hayes. Even if no one had said it out loud, it was there in the way people hesitated before speaking, in the way eyes flickered not toward him but toward Ava, measuring, reassessing, recalibrating. Daniel felt it, the subtle shift that could not be controlled with confidence or corrected with charm, and that was new. He had built his empire on reading rooms faster than anyone else, on sensing weakness before it surfaced, but tonight, he had missed something, and it was standing right in front of him. Quiet, composed, holding a wine bottle like it was nothing more than part of the job. "Tell me something, Ava," he said, leaning slightly forward now, his voice lower, more focused. "Where did you learn to read contracts like that?" It was not a compliment. Not yet. It was an investigation, a need to place her back into a category he could understand. Ava met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged. "I pay attention," she replied simply. And that was all. No credentials, no backstory, just a truth that sounded almost too small for the impact it carried. A few of the guests exchanged quiet looks, because they could hear what he was trying to do, trying to reduce her, define her, regain control by understanding her. But Ava was not offering anything he could use, and that unsettled him more than the claws ever could. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back again, his mind moving quickly now, adjusting strategy, recalculating leverage. But every path led back to the same realization. She had seen something he had not, and that meant she was either very lucky or very capable. And Daniel Hayes did not believe in luck. One of the investors spoke up again, more confident this time. We should revise the terms before moving forward. His voice carried a new weight, because now it was supported by doubt, and doubt had a way of spreading. Daniel nodded once, but his eyes never left Ava. Bring me the revised draft, he said, but it did not sound like a command directed at staff. It sounded like a request placed carefully into the room. Ava inclined her head slightly, then turned, her movements smooth, unhurried, as she stepped away from the table, heels quiet against the polished floor, disappearing briefly into the flow of the restaurant. Conversations resumed behind her, but softer now, more controlled. As if everyone understood they were no longer the center of the story, Daniel watched her go. His expression unreadable, but his thoughts anything but, because something was not aligning. The way she carried herself, the way she spoke, the way the room responded to her presence, it did not match the role she appeared to play. And Daniel had built his life on patterns, on knowing that power always looked a certain way, sounded a certain way, but Ava Monroe did not fit any of them. And that was the problem. Because when something does not fit the pattern, it usually means one thing. The pattern is about to break. And as Daniel sat there, contract closed in front of him, surrounded by people who were no longer fully on his side, he realized something he had not felt in years: uncertainty, not loud, not obvious, but there, steady and undeniable, and somewhere just beyond the edge of the room. Ava was already returning, carrying more than just a revised contract with her. Ava returned with the revised document in her hand, but it was not the paper that drew attention. It was the way the room reacted before she even reached the table. Conversations softened again, not out of politeness, but awareness, as if something unspoken had already shifted into place. Daniel Hayes noticed it immediately, the subtle deference, the way one of the senior partners straightened his posture as she approached, the way another quietly cleared space on the table without being asked. These were small things, almost invisible, but Daniel had built his entire career on noticing what others ignored, and now those same instincts were telling him something he did not want to accept. Ava placed the document in front of him with the same steady precision, her movements controlled, deliberate, as if every action carried intention. Updated terms, she said calmly, her voice even, not seeking approval, not offering explanation, just stating fact. Daniel did not reach for it right away. Instead, he looked at her again, longer this time, searching for confirmation of what he was beginning to suspect. Because people like her, people who moved like that, spoke like that, were never just what they appeared to be. You seem very invested in this deal, he said, his tone quieter now, less performative, more probing. Ava met his gaze without hesitation. I am invested in what happens in this room, she replied, and again, she gave nothing more than the truth, but it was enough. More than enough, because it did not sound like the voice of someone serving a table. It sounded like the voice of someone who owned the outcome. One of the investors leaned forward, flipping through the revised pages, his eyes widening slightly as he read. These changes protect both sides, he said slowly, almost impressed. And that was the moment it became undeniable. The shift was no longer subtle. It was structural. The room was no longer orbiting Daniel. It was recalibrating around her. Daniel finally picked up the document, scanning quickly, efficiently, and this time, he found no gaps, no oversights, no easy leverage, just clean, precise terms that forced balance, something he rarely accepted and almost never encountered. He set the paper down carefully, his fingers resting on the edge as he exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but recognition. Because he understood now that this was no accident, no coincidence. This was control, just not his. Who approved this? He asked, his voice steady. But the question carried more weight than before. Ava did not answer immediately. She simply held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, long enough for the silence to stretch, long enough for everyone at the table to feel it. And then she said, "I did." 2 simple words, but they landed with more force than anything else that had been said that night. The room stilled completely, not because they did not understand, but because they were starting to, and Daniel Hayes, for the first time since he walked in, did not have the next move. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and precise. And for a moment no one moved, not because they were confused, but because they were recalculating everything they thought they understood about the room. Daniel Hayes held her gaze, searching for any sign of hesitation, any crack in the confidence she carried so effortlessly. But there was none. Ava Monroe stood exactly where she had been, shoulders relaxed, expression calm, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened, and that was what made it undeniable, because people who pretended power always showed it too quickly. But real power did not rush, it did not explain, it simply existed. One of the investors leaned back slowly, exhaling as if releasing a truth he had just accepted. Another adjusted his jacket, no longer trying to impress Daniel, but trying to align with something else, something new. Daniel felt it again, that shift, stronger now, irreversible, the kind that did not ask for permission. He glanced briefly at the manager standing near the edge of the room. The man avoided his eyes for a fraction of a second before nodding respectfully toward Ava, and that was enough. Confirmation without words. Daniel turned back to her, this time not as a man addressing staff, but as someone trying to understand the rules of a game he had not realized he was playing. "You approved the terms," he repeated, slower now, more deliberate, as if saying it aloud might change its meaning. Ava gave a small nod. "Nothing exaggerated, just acknowledgement. I review every agreement that comes through here," she said, her voice steady, and the phrasing mattered. "Not serves, not sees, but comes through here," as if the room itself belonged to her. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his mind moving faster than his expression revealed, replaying every moment since he walked in, every assumption, every dismissal, every word he had chosen without thought. And one by one, they began to lose their certainty, because they had been built on something incomplete. The room was no longer testing Ava. It was watching him, waiting to see how he would respond now that the balance had shifted, and Daniel Hayes, a man who had built billion-dollar decisions on instinct, realized something he rarely admitted. He had underestimated the wrong person. He picked up the glass of wine finally, but did not drink. Instead he set it back down, controlled, intentional, buying himself a second more. "Then perhaps," he said carefully, choosing each word with precision now, "we should speak directly." It was not a command, not anymore. It was an adjustment, a recognition of position. Ava held his gaze for a moment, then inclined her head slightly, not in submission, but in agreement, and that small movement carried more authority than anything Daniel had said all night, because it was not given freely, it was acknowledged on her terms, and in that quiet exchange, without raised voices or dramatic gestures, the room understood what had just happened. The power had not been taken, it had been revealed, and Daniel Hayes was no longer the one holding it. The conversation did not resume the way it normally would. There was no immediate handshake, no confident smile from Daniel Hayes signaling control. Instead there was a pause, quiet but heavy, the kind that forces everyone in the room to sit inside the truth a little longer than they are comfortable with. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his posture no longer relaxed but intentional, focused, as if he had finally stepped into the same level of awareness Ava had been operating in all along. "Then, let us speak directly," he said again, this time clearer, not to assert dominance, but to establish clarity. Ava moved closer to the table, not hurried, not hesitant, simply present, her eyes steady, her attention undivided. The investors watched closely, sensing that this was no longer a negotiation they were controlling, but one they were witnessing. Daniel placed both hands on the table, fingers lightly touching the edge of the contract, grounding himself in something tangible. "What do you want changed?" he asked, and the question carried weight, because it was not about the document anymore. It was about authority. Ava glanced down briefly at the pages, then back at him. "Nothing else," she said, her voice calm. "The agreement is balanced now." And that word, balanced, settled into the room differently than any number or percentage ever could, because it implied something Daniel rarely accepted: equality. He studied her for a moment, longer than before, not searching for weakness anymore, but trying to understand the framework she was operating from. "You could have let me sign it as it was," he said, almost thoughtfully. "You would have had the advantage." Ava did not smile, did not react. She simply answered, "Advantage is temporary, structure lasts." And that was when it became clear, not just to Daniel, but to everyone listening. She was not playing the same game. This was not about winning a deal. It was about defining the terms of how power moved within it. One of the investors nodded slowly, almost unconsciously, recognizing the shift in logic. Daniel leaned back slightly, exhaling, not out of defeat, but recognition, because for the first time that night, he was not trying to outmaneuver, he was trying to align. "You built this place," he said, more as a statement than a question. Ava held his gaze, steady, unwavering. "Yes," she replied, and there was no hesitation, no embellishment, just truth. The room absorbed it all at once, not loudly, but deeply, because now everything made sense: the composure, the control, the way she moved through the space as if she belonged to it. Because she did. Daniel gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but real. "Then I misjudged you," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried more weight than any apology he had ever given. Ava did not react to the statement, did not accept it, did not reject it. She simply stood there, grounded, unchanged, because her position had never depended on his recognition. And that was the final shift, the one that could not be undone, because in that moment, everyone in the room understood something clearly. Power had never entered with Daniel Hayes. It had been there long before he arrived, and it was not leaving with him either. No one reached for their glass. No one checked their phone. Even the soft jazz in the background felt quieter, like it understood it was no longer the main performance. Daniel Hayes sat still for a moment longer, letting the weight of what he had just said settle into the room, because words like that did not belong to him easily, not misjudged, not in public, not without calculation. But this time there was no calculation left to make, only recognition. Ava Monroe did not respond to his admission, not with a smile, not with reassurance. She simply held her ground, steady as ever, and that silence carried more authority than agreement ever could. One of the investors cleared his throat gently, trying to bring the room back to familiar ground. "Shall we proceed with the updated terms?" he asked, his tone careful, respectful, and for the first time that night, the question was not directed at Daniel. It was directed at her. Ava shifted her gaze briefly toward the table, then back to Daniel, not seeking approval, but acknowledging sequence. Daniel noticed it, the subtle shift in who the room was waiting on, and instead of resisting it, he adjusted. "We proceed," he said, his voice firm but no longer dominating, more aligned than commanding. Ava gave a small nod, then stepped slightly to the side, creating space for the process to continue, not stepping back, not stepping down, just repositioning within the structure she had already defined. Documents moved across the table, pens were lifted, but slower now, more deliberate, each signature placed with a level of attention that had not existed before, because now everyone understood what was truly at stake, not just money, but awareness. Daniel signed last, not by habit, but by choice. His pen paused for a fraction of a second before touching the paper, as if marking more than just an agreement, as if acknowledging a shift he could not undo. When he finished, he set the pen down carefully, exhaling quietly, not in relief, but in clarity. The deal was done, but the night was not about the deal anymore. It was about what had been revealed through it. Daniel stood slowly, adjusting his jacket, his posture different now, not smaller, but grounded. He looked at Ava again, not searching this time, not measuring, just seeing. "Thank you," he said, and the words were simple, but real. Ava inclined her head slightly, accepting nothing, rejecting nothing, just allowing the moment to exist without needing to define it. Around them, the room began to breathe again, conversations returning, glasses lifting, the rhythm of the evening restoring itself. But something had changed beneath it all, something permanent, because the people in that room would remember this night, not for the deal, not for the numbers, but for the moment they realized they had been looking at power the wrong way the entire time. and as Daniel Hayes turned to leave, he paused for just a second, glancing back once more, not at the table, not at the investors, but at her, standing exactly where she had always belonged, and for the first time, he understood that some rooms are not entered, they are earned, and some power is not announced. It is simply recognized when it is too late to ignore. The door closed softly behind Daniel Hayes, but the presence he left behind did not follow him out. It stayed, suspended in the air like a quiet echo of something the room had just learned. Ava Monroe did not watch him leave for long. She turned back to the table, to the glasses, to the small details that had always mattered more than the spectacle. Her hands moved with the same calm precision, adjusting a napkin, aligning a glass, restoring order without urgency, because for her, nothing had been disrupted, only revealed. The investors lingered a little longer than necessary, not because business remained, but because understanding did. One of them approached her carefully, almost respectfully. "That was impressive," he said, but Ava did not respond with pride. She simply nodded once, as if the moment did not belong to her alone, but to the truth it carried. Across the room, the manager exhaled quietly, tension leaving his shoulders, but his eyes held something new now, recognition. Not of her position, but of her presence, because even those who worked beside her every day had just seen her differently, not elevated, but clarified. Outside, the city moved as it always did, cars passing, lights shifting, people unaware that inside this room, something subtle but permanent had changed. Ava stepped toward the window for a brief second, looking out at the reflection of the city against the glass. Not searching for anything, just grounding herself in the stillness that followed clarity, because power, real power, did not arrive with noise. It revealed itself in silence, and tonight, it had spoken without raising its voice. Behind her, the table was cleared, the contract signed, the deal complete, but the story did not end with signatures or numbers. It ended with awareness, the kind that lingers long after people leave, the kind that reshapes how they enter the next room. And somewhere in the distance, Daniel Hayes stepped into his car, quieter than before, not defeated, not diminished, but changed, because he had seen something he could not unsee. And Ava Monroe, standing in the place she had built, did not need to follow him, did not need to prove anything further, because she had never needed the room to recognize her. She had only needed it to be ready, and now it was.